Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day to everyone around the world, no matter what time it is for you. My name is Josh Epstein. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here with Aris, and I've had a lot of fun the past several months moderating this series of expert panel discussions that we call Pulling the Digital Thread, where we just look at all sorts of trending topics, all from the perspective of the digital thread and product lifecycle management. Our goal is just to bring together different folks, different views, independent thinkers to exchange ideas, opinions, and have some fun. So today we're not taking live questions. We are streaming on a delay, but we will definitely be looking to continue the conversation online. So if you want to use LinkedIn and have any posts, use the hashtag pulling the digital thread. And I know our panelists, myself, will be watching, and we'll continue this conversation as we go forward. So with that, let's dig in. Today, we're going to talk about the digital thread and PLM and supply chain, but really kind of double click on the food, beverage, and tobacco industries. Aris and a lot of conventional PLM tends to really look at kind of classic discrete manufacturing, but there's been just a lot of exciting work done in applying systematic product thinking, product data, and PLM best practices to the world of food, beverage, and tobacco. And so we've got some great experts here joining us today. So welcome Reese Bennett from Fulvazol, Satu Hokonen from GS1. Satu, how do I do with your name? I should have practiced before. Is that okay?
It's perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. Steven Streitberg from Philip Morris and my colleague Patrick Williamson from Aris. Maybe just to start, let's maybe just do a quick round, and if you wouldn't mind just giving a little more detailed introduction of yourself, your background, what you do, and your kind of interest in this concept of PLM, supply chain, digital threads, modern product data. Satu, we start with you.
Yes, so my name is Satu Hulkkonen. I'm based in Helsinki, Finland, and currently I work as a program manager at GS1 Finland. And my role is to lead a food data network called Food Data Finland. And this network aims to help the Finnish food sector to solve different requirements related to data and to develop organizations' data capabilities. My role is to build the network, provide services to our network, and also help the organizations with their data-related investment applications. I have approximately 20 years of experience in the food sector, from retail to food production. And during these years, I've held different positions from sourcing to product development, business management, and PLM. And I know from my own experience that the struggle that the food companies have at the moment when they are trying to manage their data. And I believe that the solution lies in common data standards and data models and collaboration. So that is my take on this topic.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to double clicking there and learning more. Stephen, can we go to you?
Yeah, it's a good link actually, Satu. Steven Streitberg. I've been working at Philip Morris for my entire career, which is getting dangerously close to 30 years in the company. I've had a very international career, worked in Asia and currently based in Switzerland. I'm IT head for the PLM function. So I'm responsible for all the PLM systems and landscape that we utilize in Philip Morris. And Philip Morris isn't a traditional PLM company. You touched on at the beginning, Josh. We're a mixture of tobacco, but also the electronics and the what I'll loosely call e-cigarettes, the alternatives to cigarettes that we now heavily focus on. And we have huge volumes, classic of an FMCG or food and beverage company. So we have about 100,000 live products at any one time. Those products are often unique by geography. There's often health warnings and regulatory, again, very similar to food and beverage, where you'll have the sugar and the salt and the whatever. We have our own element of that with tar and nicotine, so very regulated. We have a lot of controls in place because of the high taxes on our product. So there's a lot of cross-market requirements for us to monitor. we have full serialization on our electronics business, and we have full traceability from the original design that we did through to the product that's in a consumer's hand, because we report to regulatory bodies like the FDA and equivalent. So unlike a classic PLM company that might make one big complex thing, we make a large number of relatively small, simple things, but simple is not simple. And the points that Satu made with some of the traceability totally resonates with our need and what we look for in our future PLMs.
Excellent, Stephen. Excited to have you here. You and I have had the chance to chat before, and I love it's such an extreme example of complexity and variability that I'm excited to be talking with you about.
Thank you.
Reese, let's go to you. Tell us about you and Fovosol.
Yeah, no problem. So my name's Reese Bennett. I'm based in the UK, working for Fovosol. Fovosol are scattered in a few places around Europe, predominantly at the moment. Finland being one as well. So we know Satu. But yeah, so my role in the organisation for the last couple of years really has been, focused exclusively on product architecture of a package that we've developed for food and beverage. Now, as many have spoken about here, traceability is pretty much the core element in there. On top of that, we're playing around a little bit with AI. AI is a very hot topic at the moment. We're trying to incorporate that into the solution where we can. Now, typically with AI, I think the view in food and beverage is, a computer can't taste food, doesn't understand, aroma or anything like that. So trying to find use cases that actually offer value to our customers in that domain is quite a lot of interest at the moment, which we've been working on. So that's pretty much me.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm sure we will get to AI in our conversation. We'll try to wait a little bit, because once we start, I fear we won't get out of the topic. And finally, Patrick, tell us a bit about yourself for those of the community that don't know you.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah. So Patrick Willemsen, I'm based in Switzerland as well, but in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. I've been with Aris now for more than 14 years. We started small in Europe, and now we're growing. So that's really, I think, a good achievement. I'm a chemical engineer when I studied in university. So the process industry is close to my heart. So we are always, and I see more and more companies needing PLM in this space, not only food and beverage, but in general in the process industry. And then also touching the discrete manufacturing, as you do, Stephen, with the electronics, but also packaging, where you design a package and you have materials, raw materials, you produce the packaging. So there's a lot of, let's say, interesting interfaces between all of the different aspects. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, let's jump in, and Stephen, as the true practitioner here, and you've got it's great. You've got this long experience at a single company, sort of seeing how the world of PLM, of digital thread, of data and data infrastructure has changed so much over the past few decades. Maybe just talk about how you see the digital thread really relating to traceability. You and I have talked about just the requirements, the sheer complexity of how far into the supply chain you actually reach. Could you just maybe give some thoughts about how it works, where it's come, and kind of where you see it going?
Yeah, if I look at it from two directions. So one thread that we're really focusing on at the moment is that traceability back to the pure design and research, proving that what you presented to a regulatory body is exactly what you're manufacturing. For us, that means both having the traceability into the labs, into the work and the pure research that we've done, but it also means massively integrating the product spec, which is the heartbeat of the company, to all the factories, all the machines, all the inline process checking elements so that we can guarantee end-to-end integrity, traceability of our product, and that we make what we told people we would make. The other side of the journey is traceability back into the supply chain in a more classic sense of sourcing. So we trace back to 2 layers within our business. So we know the supplier's supplier of their materials, we know the batches of them, we know the integrity of those, and that enables us to guarantee quality to our consumers and to react quickly in the event of any evolution, any challenge in that area. This is super critical to us. Equally, as a high volume process, we have full traceability of what we manufacture and where that is in the ecosystem. So if we had to do a recall, if we had to find where a particular product was, we can find it within 24 hours. So having that digital thread, I almost don't call it one thread. I call it 2 or 3 threads that are maybe more it's a digital spider web that is actually connecting the different elements, in our case, from design through to consumer, down to supplier, up to wherever the product is in the ecosystem. And this is where our visions are. I'd say we're about 80% of the way there at the moment. There's always room for improvement, and the technology gets better. I'd love to talk to Reese a bit more about AI on this. But that's going to be our next big focus, is how do we get even wider and even deeper in that thread.
Yeah. Okay, and let me just play that back. I think I love the way you kind of bucket it. So threads sort of extending in a few different dimensions. One into the R&D process, making sure that you in fact are delivering the product that you set out to, that you presented to regulators, that you committed to. Then into the supply chain, are you actually really delivering what you promised, and then out into the distribution chain? It sounds like really where everything is in on the shelf everywhere.
Yeah, totally. And we can scan a product anywhere in the market and know the track it went on, which factory made it, which wholesaler dealt with it through the journey. And this comes back to the fact that we're a heavily taxed product in the tobacco side of the business. So typically governments like to know that they got their revenue, and they don't like the idea that you bought a cheap product in country X and consuming it in country Y. So we have to prove to them full traceability as well as for our own benefits. So this side of the digital thread is critical, as much as the front end is around proving that quality element.
Excellent. And maybe so too, just turning to you, because I know that you do a lot of work in this sort of traceability, and obviously there's a tremendous amount of evolution or sort of dynamic set of regulation that's happening in the EU and EMEA, but globally. Maybe you just respond to Stephen. Excuse my notes.
Absolutely. So regarding food sector and traceability, so traceability has been a basic requirement in the food sector for decades. So it's nothing new, but the focus has been mainly on food safety, meaning you need to know your supply chain one step backwards and one step forward to ensure product safety and compliance and consumer trust and efficient recall procedures and so on. But now when you think about the European Union legislation, for example, the digital product passport that the EU is promoting doesn't include food and beverage at the moment, but other similar upcoming regulations are coming, and they are especially related to sustainability. And these regulations are requiring that the companies understand their supply chains further and more in detail. So this is a big shift. This is bringing more pressure to the companies, of course, because one step backwards and one step forward doesn't suffice anymore. And the new requirements might involve, for example, gathering greenhouse gas data from your whole supply chain. From my point of view, it has been challenging to communicate these new requirements to the companies because they think that they already have a full traceability that is needed. But I think that the companies have to think about how they manage their internal data, but also how they gather and share the data to other supply chain members, quite often customers and suppliers. So I would say that the companies need to see their data management from new angles in the future. So it's not only about their internal data management. It doesn't suffice anymore. They shouldn't create their own internal data models anymore, which has been the case for many years. And they also need to think about ways to gather the data from their supply chain and also how to share the data forward. And I think they also need new reporting skills and capabilities to combine the data from different sources. So I think these are kind of like the things that the companies need to think about.
Yeah. Satu, I'd love your opinion on the product definition, how we standardize that at not just in a company, but at a industry level. One of the things we're doing at the moment is we've traditionally looked at it from a manufacturing perspective, and we have a product that a factory produces, but more and more we're looking at it from a consumer perspective, and with multiple sourcing, multiple vendors that might be providing raw materials. And then do you see them as the same? Do you see them as different? This is changing the dynamic. And then when you connect that to things like AI and reporting, if you see them all as different, your reports go all over the place. If you see them all the same, you miss granularity. What's the GS1 view of that?
I think there are different solutions to that. I think it starts from the unique identification of products, suppliers. You can, for example, identify a factory or a factory line with GLNs. So I think it's a big possibility. But of course, we also need kind of like common contracts, or we need to agree on certain things that this could happen. And I remember from my past when we tried to create kind of like this universe of products and raw materials related to the products and suppliers and so on, it was very difficult to understand what is kind of like the whole universe of the products and the suppliers and their suppliers and everything. So I can see that the standards are the way to go, because if each and everyone tries to figure out their own way to classify these, so it will be a big mess, in my opinion.
For those that are maybe not familiar with GS1, or kind of where will these standards emerge from, or kind of what's GS1's position on this? Is this going to be driven by the organizations, or does it have to be kind of?
So we say that we are the best kept secret in the industry, because we are part of everyone's lives with the barcodes, but nobody hears from us anything. So we are kind of like a big secret. So of course, each GS1 country is driving a kind of like their own industry. So basically, each country can decide themselves on which industries they focus on. And in Finland, we focus on food very much. And that's why we drive kind of like the evolution of food standardization within the data world. But I guess that we don't want to push anything. So basically, the industry has to decide themselves what standards they want to adopt. So that is kind of like our role. But of course, our responsibility is to bring kind of like the understanding and the benefit of standards to the industries. So that is kind of like our role.
Stephen, I'm curious, because clearly Philip Morris has buying power within your network of suppliers. Are you able to kind of impose standards, or how do you think about kind of the sort of standards and data sharing and kind of like?
It's actually a really interesting question that's changed a lot in the last, let's say, 7 to 10 years. In the traditional tobacco business, we're the biggest player in the world. And if we want a barcode that looks this way, even if it's stupid, we get it. If you look at the new world, though, as we move into electronics, we're just one of many. There's plenty of companies that are much bigger than us in this part of the world, and we go to them and say, we want resistors this way, and they laugh at us and say, you're a rounding error on our numbers, just get in line. So I think, whereas in the past we've taken inspiration from things like GS1, but then taken our own spin on it, more and more we need to be partnering and driving industry standards beyond our own traditional industry. And I think that's an important evolution that we're on at the moment. I think we've gone the right way, but I think we have further to go.
Interesting. And I said a whole bunch of other questions, but I want to kind of get through everyone, and then we can kind of circle back. Reese, I know you talked about your focus on AI. Well, let's sort of open up the AI kind of worms here. Clearly, AI runs on data, right? And the cleaner the data, the more context that the data carries with it, the more powerful AI can be. More powerful AI solutions you can bring to bear. Where do you see the biggest opportunity for AI or automation within PLM for food, beverage, tobacco organizations now, and how's that likely to change over the coming years?
I think from an AI perspective, as you say, as long as you've got the data there, you pretty much got access to do anything you like. Now, the biggest areas from a benefit perspective in the longer term is from an MPD perspective. You could have 10,000 different products in development or proposed by AI that are then refined down by your food scientists. So there's that potential, but obviously I think the concern with AI from a lot of people is protection of IP. Now, no one wants to publish their secret ingredient, their secret recipe to AI. So it's coming up with a means of preventing that data leaking from an organization and being published to OpenAI or wherever. Now, there's a couple of ways, clever ways that we've seen of people resolving that issue. Is one, using local language models, so potentially having your own AI embedded within your organization, so you're not publishing externally; it stays in house. Now, the problem with that is a local AI will not move as quickly as as an external AI.
Yep.
So I think the best approach that I've seen so far is querying or putting a prompt to the AI to then query your data set. So you're not actually pushing any data. You're just saying, build me the query on my data set. I want to see the most recent, most recent product that's been released, within this certain criteria. It builds that query, and then you push that to your data set, and it gives you your response. Now that's a really clever use of AI that I've seen. But in terms of the possibilities, they're pretty much endless. I think when you look a little bit broader, particularly for the life cycle assessment. So I think we've been talking there, and from a sustainability perspective, being able to interpret the numbers and put them into a format that is applicable for people that want to, measure carbon footprint, measure water usage on crops, all that sort of stuff. It's not easy without having a team of lots of different sustainability engineers with lots of different backgrounds and lots of different ways of doing things to be able to take those numbers, interpret them, and put them in a format that is ready for someone that wants to read them in a particular way. So AI has that potential to convert and interpret that data quickly. But ultimately, the data needs to be there in the first place, which I think comes back to, like we said, a standard sort of data model that everyone's working to, that then can be interpreted from that point.
I know, absolutely. And Patrick, I'm curious your perspective. I know Aris talked a lot about the primacy of governance, right? And if you're going to really be able to expose AI models to your data, to your intellectual property, it really is all about data governance, or really kind of system governance. If you're going to maintain all the AI in house, that's one thing. More practically speaking, though, you're really kind of, I think, thinking of a data architecture strategy that allows you proper governance. Patrick, maybe just your perspective. I know you've done a lot of interesting projects integrating PLM into some of the leading food and beverage brands, as well as broader other process technologies. What are your thoughts on governance, but in general, just your thoughts on leveraging kind of conventional PLM for more of that new product development, kind of accelerating new product development, accelerating time to market? Kind of where are you seeing kind of the most exciting application of PLM and digital threads within this space?
So yeah, we see a lot of data still buried in files. So it's very often document based, right? And that's already a little bit of a problem if you want to, if you're talking about data model. So you have to be able to get data out of files and put it into let's say a good data model with good relationships that you can follow the thread that you, and then the PLM should deliver you the flexibility to create a data model based on data standards, and those standards will evolve over time. So you need to have the flexibility to also change it in a certain way over time. What we also see, if you have, let's say, recipes and formulations and ingredients in a system as data nodes, then you can also use them in many different ways. Like, for example, we have a customer that uses that data also in PLM within the ideation process. So they start the ideation inside PLM, reusing data that they already have in the system, recipes or formulations, and from that building new products, and are able to actually speed up the time to market because they can reuse a lot of that data. Whereas if you have it in files somewhere, you have to scratch them together, try to make sense of it, and try to control it over the lifetime of a product. So I think making data that's accessible through a standard data model and evolving the data model and extending it also into, let's say, other processes than just the recipe management or the formulation management. That's, I think, a good value proposition of PLM.
Okay, how do we get into this? So I think we did a good job talking through kind of what we'd all like to see, or sort of describing the basics of the challenge and opportunity space. How do you do this? And maybe Stephen, let's start with you. I'm sure the challenge of files and massive data lakes full of unstructured documents and the like is part of what you live. How do you start this? How do you start this idea of kind of corralling that and putting it in a way that, one, you can apply traceability, but you can also think about extracting intelligence through AI? Like, how do you start this process?
Look, as they say, data is the new oil. You definitely need to have structures. You definitely need to have ways of seeing your data. I wanted to link back to Reese a little bit. The sexy side of AI is the front-end research, R&D type stuff that you mentioned, and we're all very excited about where that's going. But something slightly less sexy, but twice as powerful, is using AI to improve your data quality. If we're dealing with 100,000 finished products, we're dealing with over 1 million raw and semis. A 1% error rate is a disaster. We need methodologies to drive cleanliness, to drive standardization, to self-heal the system. Otherwise, your MRP processes, your manufacturing processes can all be compromised. And I think we totally miss the grunt work that AI can do to expose the challenges in that area and give us overall better data. Now, once you've got your data at a maturity level that you're targeting, now the exploitation comes. And that's where Patrick's point was really important. We're talking about design for X, so whether that's carbon dioxide or water, whatever it might be. If you've got great data and you've got a flexible tool to bring it to the forefront, now you can make real decisions you trust and decisions you will act on. Because so often, if you don't have that integrity of foundational data, the system will give you a result and you'll go, no, that's not believing that. I'm going to go do something else like I've always done because it must just be crappy data. Forgive me. So I think the more we can get that standard right, the more we can get that end-to-end through the ecosystem, which is where Satu's area is so important, because it's not just my data, it's my supplier's data, it's my customer's data. And the more I can self-heal the data so that it's at a very high quality, now I can make good decisions. And that's where I want to drive the next steps in my processes here, because then I make good decisions.
Well said. I'm curious, Satu, Reese, thoughts on maybe Satu, I'm curious, in the world of standards and the world of kind of crafting these data models, what's your perspective on AI, and how does AI fit into that? Whether it's a motivator to why you should adopt a standard data model, or perhaps a tool for making it a more practical reality.
I think one of the problems in food and beverage in particular is raw materials has tended to be a bit of a wild west. I think that's I might be quoting Satu there from a couple of engagements before, but yeah, everyone deals at a product level, tends to work at a product level. Raw materials come in, and then the traceability and the history of the raw materials lost. Now, as Stephen, as you're saying there, if we can cleanse that data, then every step of the process is a hell of a lot easier. Defining sustainability as one, allergen control, recall management, everything is derived ultimately from the raw materials. If we have a raw material that comes in that's it's got a defect, it's been contaminated with an allergen, then tracing back where that raw material lies when it just came across in a spreadsheet and we put it into a product is nigh impossible. But if there's, like we say, if there's a digital thread there that links directly to that raw material, it's a lot easier. And from an AI perspective, being able to query quickly where that is, asking a human question and getting a human response, it's in these 5 products, would be really powerful. Now, as we say, there's some grunt work, some lifting, some heavy lifting before to get to that point. But it's ultimately we have to start at some point. And I think organizations that are starting this journey at the moment, it's get every granular level of your data in the platform as in your PLM as soon as possible. And once that data is there, you've got the power at your fingertips to play with AI, to just even to do things manually. It's a hell of a lot easier. So yeah, it's Stephen. I don't know whether I think you quoted 30,000 plus raw materials, that sort of thing.
I think raw's getting closer to 1 million.
Yeah, so big organization.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot of heavy lifting. Hopefully, it can be done in. If the supply chain comes on board with this as well, ultimately the raw materials they're supplied to the likes of big food and bev companies, people like Philip Morris, if they're publishing their data in a way that's directly compatible and we talked about the standard data model, then it makes the job a lot easier.
It's an interesting point when you talk about footprint. I often quote some of the stats of my world, so forgive me for being a bit selfish. We're at about 7,000 users across a company that is sort of 80 to 100,000 people, because it's not just the product developers that use a PLM tool. It is supply chain. It is finance. It is the whole commercial business. We're feeding the PIMS and the e-ordering platform as much as we're feeding a MES in a factory. And all are equally important. The whole lifecycle management is also super important. You want to be able to register something on your e-ordering system a month before it becomes manufactured. You might not have even approved the spec at that stage. So managing integrity and managing risk around the life cycle of a product when we have huge numbers of changes. I talk about 100,000 finished products. We do 20,000 specification changes a month, 1,000 a day. Now, they can mean settings on machines, they can mean raw materials, they can mean process settings. You need to keep all that under control. You need proper systematic management of this. And that's why I said the non-sexy part of AI is to give you integrity and control of this. But this is super powerful. We get this right, a lot of things go really well. You get it even a few % wrong, you will be famous. Not for a good reason.
But back to Philip Morris, you have power as being Philip Morris, but I'm curious more broadly. Does this require regulation? Does this require market makers like Philip Morris kind of driving best practices throughout their supply chain? I mean, how does this come to be?
I think there's a mixture, to be fair. I think there is an element where regulatory bodies have their expectations that maybe motivate the landscape to move. But I think there's also a belief in what the customer needs and what your promising to the customer, particularly in ourselves at the moment, going from a cigarette business to an alternative. We have to explain why the alternative is better, and we have to explain the integrity of that alternative. So full traceability, full serialization, the ability to contact someone that has an electronic device and talk to them as an individual rather than as someone that bought it 6 months ago and we've lost touch is important for us. So that element of the thread into what is a product that has a lifespan beyond our point of sale is also something for us that's super critical now that was not 10 years ago. 10 years ago, similar to the food and bev industry, you could assume within a couple of days of sale, the product had been consumed. Now you have a product that may have its battery changed, that may get a new software version, that may have a maintenance routine on it, and you need to manage that life cycle as well.
Let's maybe, and this is that area of tobacco is fascinating, but it makes me think. In Reese, I was reading some of your kind of tracking your LinkedIn feed, and I can see you're passionate about brands and about how different food and beverage brands can really different ways that they can differentiate. So I'm curious, as we look to the future of food and beverage and tobacco, how does data kind of impact the kind of these new branding ideas? And I think that it's beyond just the transformation of the product, like Stephen was talking about, really into how people think about the brands, whether it's an energy drink or a candy or an organic food. How is this data going to relate to the way these brands kind of differentiate?
Yeah, of course. So I think the biggest point or the main starting point is knowing your customer. Now, when you're developing a product, you can develop a product. Everyone around you can say how wonderful it is, but often they're just being polite. By having the data, you can actually look at how that resonates with your customers. Now, pilot testing, consumer testing, large scale tests, being able to interpret that data quickly is tricky. Is always difficult because of the numbers you're dealing with. But being able to have that data available, and again being able to interpret that data is pretty cool. So you can see whether you've got a market fit quickly or a lot quicker if you have the data available. If you're going off of gut feel or what you expect the market wants, or just looking at a standard evolution of a product, that's not necessarily the way to go. Particularly in the last few years, at least, sustainability has become something rather than is a nice to have. It's what consumers expect, because they expect to see sustainability and see your credentials and see where the product's from, where it's been sourced, and how you're potentially recycling that product at the end of life, or packaging at end of life. Then you need to be able to demonstrate that, and also there's going to be something around the corner that people are expecting soon. Yeah. Now, from a branding perspective, I know that personalization of products has cropped up again recently. So Coca-Cola started putting names on bottles and everything again. So hark back to the 90s. But yeah, that people's expectations of personalization are a lot higher as well. So not only can you test the products and how they perform from a flavor perspective or any profile that you want to test, but you can also test how the brand is resonating with your consumers. So personalization, whether a name ticks the box, I found my name on the bottle, whether that's acceptable, whether people are expecting more in the TikTok era, then it might be, yeah. But having data to be able to analyze what you've done, how it's performed, and how you can tweak it and improve is core to all of that.
Yeah. So too, I'm curious in your perspective here, and you brought up the emerging or ever increasing focus on sustainability. How do these emergence of common data models expand to sort of take into account new definitions of sustainability?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Well, it's just maybe comment more broadly on trends in sustainability and environmental footprint in the work that you see with emergence of common data models?
Yeah. When I think about the time, for example, 4 years ago, the companies didn't want to talk about traceability because they already had it fixed. But now they understand the importance, for example, from the sustainability requirements that are coming, that they need to develop their capabilities even further. So I think it's a big driver, the sustainability work that they are doing. They have to report the data to officials. They need to report it to the companies that they are selling to. And so it's a big topic, and I think it's a big driver in the food sector to create more kind of like this interoperable data that we're seeing now. And I think that the work that we have been doing at GS1 Finland is to really show that why do we need these interoperable models and data standards and so on, is that we have been doing these guidelines, these kind of like instruction manuals that companies can adopt. They can see kind of like tips on how to adopt these data models and standards, and we are also doing these kind of like pilots that they see what is the benefit in these common models. And these actually are also available in English, so in Finnish, but also in English. So if you want to download them from our GS1 Finland website, so that is also possible. So I think it's a lot of work, but I think that the companies are now seeing the benefit in these common models.
Stephen, how are you? I guess as you think about the strategies for data architecture, how much do you look into these these standard data models? How much are you thinking about your own internal priorities? How much are you just innovating? So many directions you could take this, and
Look, we're in the middle of a fairly major project at the moment, and I'd say 25 to 30% of it was around the product data definition and reimagining that for the future. The legacy PLM system we have was built 25 years ago when we were a cigarette-only business. So the questions we use to define what is a product don't make any sense in an electronics, heavily regulated world of the alternatives. I link a little bit also to Reese's point on the marketing side. I spoke about having 20,000 specification changes a month. Now, some of those might result in a new SKU, some will not. Yet you still want to see whether the success in the market was as expected. So the ability to have traceability beyond the core product definition into other elements, whether it's batch or serialization or just effectivity dates, so that you can see that the new variant is more successful than the last or less, and make decisions on it in reasonable time is super critical. So if you get your data structures right, if you can add to the core lots of additional metadata so that you can do secondary analysis off the core without over complexifying your volume, because obviously the more you change the core, the more you tend to multiply the SKU count, then you can truly make those insightful decisions and have the granularity you need when you need it and avoid it when you don't. And I think that was a big part of our vision and our success of what we're doing right now with the data model change, is trying to balance not over complexifying, not making a new code for everything, but still having the granularity to make decisions.
Right. So Stephen, do you see this data model evolving even beyond what you're doing now? So how is that dynamics going in
It's an interesting question.
Line?
I think the core of it will probably be something you change a little bit less frequently. It tends to touch so many things. As I said, we're integrated massively through supply chain or finance. So any one change to the structure tends to have some pretty significant ripple effects. beauty of the secondary data elements is that they're a little bit more absorbable by downstream on need. So using those effectively can help us a lot. But one of the goals was to break away from a single product category traditional business that we are into something that can cope with an electromechanical, that can cope with a pharmaceutical, that can cope with a getting close to a medical in some cases, or cope with a traditional tobacco product.
There's a lot of discussion right now, and I think Patrick, you were at the Share PLM conference, and I've just been tracking some of the conversations online about data models. The role of graph databases, the role of structured databases, and how they work together. And Patrick, I know that I've seen some of your work. It's not just about product data. There's product data, then there's sort of the metadata that describes it, and then there's all of the ancillary product lifecycle information, and obviously, maintaining relationships between all that information in such a way that you can navigate your digital thread, that an AI can understand it. I'm curious, Patrick, you're how do you counsel clients on how to think about this, both for information that exists today, as well as planning for a flexible future, right? Where you the right for an organization to get smarter and kind of add more.
So I mean the Share PLM Summit was focusing a lot on the human aspects. And I think if we look at the digital threads, and Stephen, you already said it, it's not just one thread, but there are so many threads, right? And for different roles in the organization, different people, different, let's say, stakeholders, you have different viewpoints or threads, basically. So obviously the primary data is important, but also the secondary data and the viewpoint on that data going into the primary data, that's extremely important. And that's where we help a lot. And I think also Reese helps a lot on let's say, helping the clients to understand those different viewpoints and how you can navigate those threads or the network, the spider network, basically.
Reese, maybe, I know you work with organizations of all different sizes. How do you, obviously Philip Morris, where you have a organization and resources, and Stephen, I'm sure you you need more resources. It's not like everyone needs more resources.
I understand. We're a significant company,
but how do you counsel maybe smaller suppliers and how to think about how to start their journey? And maybe they have a PLM system, maybe they don't, right? But how do they start this journey in a way that they can set themselves up for long-term success?
Yeah, well, ultimately, you're only ever going to be as successful, as the tools you use. We're in an age where data, ultimately is power, and so if you want to move quickly and you want to succeed, you need to have access to that data. Looking at, I guess, as an example of the current climate, all that sort of thing. Products have always, in food and bev anyway, products have always been very, very optimized from a raw material level for pricing. So if we want to have a lower price point, then we go to this supplier. Now that's still the same, but it's not just about pricing anymore. There's lots of, a certain bit of it is with tariffs and bits and pieces from a geopolitical perspective, but there's also climate change, where there's droughts in certain regions, where a normally typical supplier that you'd use, which would have a certain amount of yield that you could take, that's a lot smaller yield now, and so you can't just use that supplier. So agility is a lot more important. And if you want to be agile, you need to know what can come into your product, what you can swap, what you can bring in without drastically impacting the flavor of the product, the shelf life, any of those factors, those core profiles of what you've developed. So in order to do that, you need to understand where your product is today, and then you need to understand everything around it. Every single raw material that you could potentially substitute if a scenario arose that you have to swap something out. So that's without managing that information, you put yourself at a weakness.
I have a question. How do you see these old legacy systems in the food sector? Because I think this is a big problem. I think that the companies are very afraid to replace the old legacy systems because they are afraid that if something changes, are they able to deliver the products to the customers? Are there going to be big problems and so on? So I think this is a big challenge, in my opinion, that the companies are afraid to kind of like rock the boat in a way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of the time, in order to take out legacy systems which are no longer fit for purpose in a lot of instances, there's people there within an organization that brought that solution to the organization. They've used it day in, day out for a long time. And so, doing the whole change education piece, making sure it's a cultural thing as much as a benefits to the organization that needs to be implemented. And a lot of the time, you run parallel systems as a proof of concept, those sort of steps through. But it's it's trying to make people appreciate they're living in a past age to a certain extent. They're playing with a Nokia 3310 rather than an iPhone. And so there's that transition that you need to say, look, you're missing out on these benefits. And those benefits ultimately impact bottom line. So if you want to, if the organization you want to grow and you want to be profitable, you need to take advantage of the tools that are available to you at any given time. So, but as you said, though, it's always a challenge. And
time for some, I think, just some closing thoughts here. Satya, I'm curious. I mean, how would you, what's the one thing you want, our listeners to think about when they think about, plotting their strategy for the next 10 years? What would be the one piece of advice you'd have for them?
Well, I think the happy point is here that the data standards are already ready. They are available. We just have to adopt them. So that's a big thing. And I would just suggest that the companies wouldn't create their own data models just for themselves, because that won't work in the end. So that is kind of like my tip to the companies.
Excellent. Stephen, I know you have probably many scars, learned many lessons. What piece of advice would you have for your colleagues out there around the world?
Yeah, actually, Satu's point, I think, is fair. Trying not to reinvent the wheel when you don't have to is a great starting point. There's reasons why these standards exist, and if you can exploit them, you're a long way on the right track. I think trying not to get too ambitious and not to over-complexify, particularly at the beginning of a journey. Reese mentioned the challenge of adoption of a new landscape. One of the things we have is we're just massively integrated. So you start off with a PLM project, and before you know it, you're doing an ERP project, a MuleSoft project, a hosting project, and a finance project, all intertwined. So managing the scale of the journey, having a vision of what you want to achieve with your data and your digital threads is critical, but taking it in steps, I would say, is probably a wise move. Trying not to do it all in one bite.
Wise advice. With that, I do want to be conscious of the time here. So, Patrick, your last thoughts.
Yeah, so I can agree with Sato and Stephen. Don't eat the whole elephant at once, and say do the proof of concepts and start piloting, involving the end users early so they understand your journey.
Fair point.
I think that's absolutely vital.
Yeah, excellent. And Reese, you get the last word.
Oh, pressure. It's just, I guess the main point for me would just to be embrace the technology, embrace the tools that you have available to you. Unless you're checking back into the market and seeing what you can do and how you can do it, you always get the same results from doing the same things. So see what's available, check it out, and embrace it and take advantage of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time here. Fascinating conversation. Please, for everyone listening, let's keep the conversation going online. You can use that hashtag pulling the digital thread. And everyone, my sincere thanks for being part of this discussion. Really, really a fun time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks.